Welcome back, friends. On to our debate 3. China is increasing its belligerence in India's neighborhood. Foxed by the Modi government policies that have made relations with our immediate neighbors stronger and more resilient, China has opened its book of dirty tricks, from buying out corrupt leaders to pontificating and even using arm-twisting tactics. From Pakistan to Sri Lanka to Maldives and Bhutan and now even Nepal. This, as the Chinese delegation lectured Nepali politicians on how to chart their foreign policy, especially with respect to India and the United States. We are going to get you a lowdown on that from Kathmandu, with guys joining in from New Delhi and Beijing, of course. Have a look at what has happened and then I come back.
A belligerent China cornering tiny Nepal. Speak who we tell you to, says Sun Haiyan, the Vice Minister of China's International Liaison Department. Haiyan, backed by China's Communist Party, wants relations with India and US to be minimized. The remarks were made at a conference in Kathmandu between Nepali and Chinese representatives. This even as a pro-China government in Maldives has heeded the advice given to Kathmandu and suffering as such.
We may be small, but that doesn't give you the license to bully us. Shukriya.
External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar says, bring it on.
We should say, okay, global politics is a competitive game. You do your best, I will do my best. So, it cannot be. Today, China is a major economy. It will deploy resources. It will try and shape things in China's way. Why should we expect otherwise?
China is brazenly asserting itself on small nations in India's neighborhood. How should India respond? Let's debate.
We are going to be joined in by Sushant Sareen. He's a senior fellow of ORF. He's going to be joining us from New Delhi. The Beijing view is going to come from Ina Tanjan, and he's a political affairs commentator. He would be joining us live from Beijing. And I would want to begin with my friend Anil Giri. He's a senior journalist with the Kathmandu Post. He's joining us live from Kathmandu just in a bit. And basically, the debate is engendered by a development that took place in Nepal yesterday, in Kathmandu, where a Chinese Communist Party delegation led by their leader, Sun Haiyan, met with leaderships of many of these political parties in Nepal and sort of lectured them on what their foreign policy should be, particularly vis-a-vis India and United States. In fact, all the guests have joined me. There was some audio issue, I think. So let me go to Kathmandu first for the Nepal view. Very good evening, Anil Giri, and thanks for joining us on this broadcast. I actually spotted your story on the manner in which Sun Haiyan was speaking to Nepali leaders and in public, and that's what caught my attention. So I thought, let's try to understand what the Chinese are up to in our backyard, and that's why we are having this conversation. Anil Giri, if you can tell us, what was this meeting about? Why had this Chinese delegation come? And given the tone and tonality, how was the delegation received by the Nepali leaders with whom they interacted?
So thank you, Abhishek ji. Are you listening to me right now?
Yes, you're clear. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So probably this is the 15th or 16th delegation from China in last 1 year. So the Chinese the numbers of Chinese are, the delegation in Kathmandu has been very, sharply increased after the China lifted the COVID restrictions. So, and several CPC leaders and the provincial party leaders have visited Kathmandu, and so many other leaders from Nepali Communist Party, UML, and the Maoists, they have also visited to China. So there is the frequency of visit between Nepal and China have been increased in the year 2023, and that we have also seen the similar kind of things in 2024 also. But this particular visit is something interesting that Chinese never used to speak like in a public in that way, that they have vented their ire, their frustration, particularly two three things. Basically, uh, in the that political party consultation meeting. This is the first time that Chinese, they asked all the second rank leader of major political party representing the Nepali parliament and discuss the issue of their concerns, like why BRI is not implementing in Nepal, or why BRI project is getting delayed, why there is a kind of perception or the kind of narrative in Kathmandu about the BRI, that BRI is a debt trap. So Chinese ambassador, he tried to clarify that no, BRI is not a debt trap, uh, because it's so many countries have taken assistance from BRI, and no country have been stuck any kind of debt trap. The second thing is that they have also expressed concern over some of the delays over the projects that have undertaken by the Chinese. There are several media reports in Kathmandu in Nepali media about the Chinese projects are not getting up to the mark, or they are not making progress, desired progress in Nepal. So that is also their concerns, and they are also trying to there is also a concern in that some powers or some countries, particularly they didn't name any country, India or US, but we can easily sense that it must be India and US. Their allegation was directed to India and the US, that some countries are trying to create a misinformation and disinformation about our relation with Nepal. So this was quite kind of
Right.
blunt kind of a statement that's been made in Kathmandu.
Right.
And for the first time publicly, the CPC leader made this kind of, allegation to the Nepali, political party, because there were, political party leaders from
Right.
major political parties of Nepal. Hmm.
Right. Okay. So, before I go to Mr. Tenjan for understanding the Beijing view on this, coming to you, Sushant, as Anil Giri says, there has been a spike or increase in delegation visits by the Chinese Communist Party. This is not the Chinese government, but the Communist Party. You would say they are one and the same thing. But then the fact that at the political level, the engagement is being increased in Nepal, as we have seen the case of Maldives, Sushant, and the repercussions of that. Also, the public lecturing of the second-rung leadership of Nepal about BRI, about how to choose their friends and well-wishers vis-a-vis China. Obviously, Beijing thinks it can really brazen it out like this and get away with it. Sushant.
Yeah, so Abhishek, there are a couple of things involved out here. Number one, I think we have to recognize that China, with its growth, the fact that it's the second largest economy, it's a big power in its own right. Probably doesn't compare to the US even now, but it is a big power, and we have to recognize that reality. So there will be many more engagements of the Chinese today than what they were 20 years back. So I think we need to recognize that's going to happen. It will happen in Nepal. It will happen in all of uh, the subcontinent and South Asia. It will happen in other geographies. And I don't think anybody can really have a problem with that. But having said that, what is also happening is that the way the Chinese are engaging with some of the smaller countries, uh, not only in its neighborhood, but also in its extended
This is not engagement,
neighborhood.
Sushant. Sorry to be interrupting, but this is intimidation, cajoling
No, no, so
mixed with
one
threat.
second, Abhishek, put your
This
horses.
is power
Coming
of
to that.
suggestion
So,
mixed with power of
no,
threat.
so one second. One is that engagement will happen, but what is happening is that increasingly what we are seeing is that the Chinese diplomacy, which earlier used to, be a very non-interventionist kind of diplomacy, has become a lot more interventionist. And again, whether it's the Chinese government representatives, it's Chinese businesses, or it's Chinese Communist Party, they act as of one whole entity, right? And a lot of time it gives them a certain degree of plausible deniability that it was not the government, it was the party which was doing it. But they have started interfering, they have started intervening, they have started mediating. All kinds of things have started happening from the Chinese side. And what Mr. Giri is describing, this is very clearly, we've seen it in other parts of the world as well. This is very clearly a kind of subtle intimidation tactic that I use, that in a somewhat subtle manner, you are threatening your interlocutors in other countries that, look, if you don't do this, or if you do this, then there will be certain consequences that will follow. So I think this has been a pattern of Chinese diplomacy. I don't know whether they call it wolf diplomacy or whatever other animal they want to use to describe kind of diplomacy. But this diplomacy has increasingly been seen. We've seen it in Pakistan in many cases. We've seen it in other parts of South Asia. We've seen it in Sri Lanka. We've seen it in some parts of Central Asia. We've seen it in Africa. We've seen it in a number of places. This is exactly the same template which we are seeing in the Maldives and which we are seeing in Nepal. Then the Chinese also use another tactic. What they use is a combination of blandishment and bribery. So many of the politicians are, they pump in huge amounts of money to increase the political capital of politicians who suck up to them, number one. And number two, use that same amount of money to buy influence and then try and play around with the politics of a particular country. So that is another thing which has happened. We've seen that again in the Maldives. We've seen that in Sri Lanka. We've seen it in some parts of Central Asia. So that is again a kind of diplomacy which they've been following. So while one does not have a problem with the Chinese, footprint which is increasing, that's a natural progression of things. But the way they have started intervening and the way they've started forcing the things down other people's throat, I think that's a matter of serious concern, because the next step of that is going to be that they will intervene in these countries either to set up military bases or for some other nefarious activity, and that is a matter of serious concern to countries like it.
No, Sushant, you see, it's dangerous also for these nations to be indulging with Beijing at their own expense. So we have a government in Maldives, for example, which is welcoming to a Chinese spy ship, but then won't use India's Dornier aircraft for humanitarian evacuation, medical evacuation, rescue, because of which in the last 7 days, at least 2 lives have already been lost in Maldives. So obviously, the interventionist diplomacy of China, and I'm taking this question to Mr. Ina Tenjin now, the interventionist carrot and stick diplomacy of China is actually to the detriment of these smaller nations, Mr. Tenjin. So you accused the United States of using its money and muscle power, and that being bad. China itself is guilty of that, right?
No. You can characterize it however you like, but at this juncture, you have to look at the facts. There was an election in Nepal. They had disputes with India and China about a very sensitive area, 400 square kilometers, at the India-Nepal-China tri-junction in western Nepal. And from 1975 onwards, Nepal has been trying to maintain a policy of balancing India and China, and they continue to do that. What you said earlier when you introduced this topic, that, what is China doing in our backyard? Well, this is something that the U.S. used to say about South America. It wasn't necessarily greeted there very well. They resented the idea that one nation thought that they were under the sway of another nation. They consider themselves to be sovereign, even though they're smaller. So at this point, China has done something unusual, which is to voice what they have been saying in private, in public, because they feel it's a little bit strange. On one hand, you have, Nepali leaders saying that, Nepal expects commencement of projects, including the second ring road expansion in Kathmandu, outer ring road, hydropower projects, transmission lines, and the Chahar tunnel. So, I mean, if you want China to invest and do things, they have to be allowed to do it without the interference of other countries. And this is really the issue. They feel very strongly that India and the US are aligned, and that they are trying to use these small countries as part of this containment strategy that's going on. So at this point, there's a lack of trust, obviously, between China and India. These types of situations in these smaller nations amplify that distrust. And unfortunately, it doesn't serve anybody.
It doesn't serve anybody, but I think the Chinese are not that innocent. I'll come to Sushant to take an answer about what Mr. Tanjan says, that this is a response to some containment strategy which India and the US might be doing together in tandem. But Anil Giri, you must have heard what Mr. Tanjan was saying. My question is this really the first time that the Chinese have gone public? Remember the last Chinese ambassador to Kathmandu, Hu Yanqi? She was so publicly engineering a government, if I could say. She was seen publicly to be saving the Oli government from falling, right, Anil Giri? So it's not that the Chinese have been softly intervening. They have been very hard at even government formation, etc. in Nepal.
So that is a very old story. As our panelist friend was saying, that I think he has not probably closely monitoring or following the developments in Kathmandu. First thing is that these issues which the Chinese side raised in Kathmandu recently are not associated with any boundary dispute between China and India. These are very, very fundamental issues between Nepal and China. And at the same program, one senior communist leader, he gave a very befitting answer. He told the Chinese leaders, you have promised several things in the past. You have promised to build the hydropowers, you have promised to build the roads, you have promised to build bridges and tunnels and ring roads, and it is your job to carry out the development project that you have promised to deliver. You have to deliver. That's one thing, this is very important. The second thing is that India and US know. So it is not, I think India and US probably are not instigating to anyone to do this kind of things, because China and India, we have to live up. Nepal has to live up with both neighbors, India and China, quietly. But it is a prime minister, it is a minister, it is a government officials. We have been telling that please do complete your things on time. Please complete the project on time. So we have not executed a single project on the BRI. Okay. So it was the foreign minister who made a statement in the parliament. Not a single project under the BRI has been executed in Nepal. And a Chinese ambassador claimed that Pokhara, newly built Pokhara airport, is under BRI. The minister said that no, it is not
Yeah,
under the BRI. So there are certain
of
misunderstandings between
course.
Nepal and China, and these kind of things are not instigated by anyone. So these are, this version, Chinese version were,
Exactly.
so Chinese version were totally, rejected and refused by our own prime minister, our own minister, and our government officials. There is no need to be triggered by any third party and any
There you
third
go, Mr.
country.
Tenjan.
Sorry, my
There you
friend.
go, Mr. Tenjan. It's not India doing it. It's not the
Do you
United
want me
States
to
doing it.
answer,
Perhaps
or
the
do you
Chinese
just
are a
want
little
to cheer?
psyched out. As Anil Giri says, there are some serious concerns about Chinese projects which have been raised by the Nepali leadership, which have been left unaddressed by Beijing, and that's why a situation has emerged where, for example, on the Pokhara International Airport, the Chinese say, oh, this is BRI.
You fail to
The
understand
Nepali
what they're
leadership has to
saying.
come out
It's
in
very
public say,
simple.
for God's sake, this
They
is
say,
not
you
BRI.
expect
Same
us
with
to
the
complete these
WeChat
projects,
Pay.
but
The Chinese said this is
they say
BRI,
that
which it
there
is not.
are
So obviously there are
impediments,
protests
for
within
them
the
to do that.
Nepali leadership.
If I'm in your country, I have to
against.
go through your zoning process. I have to get permissions from your departments, and I have to be allowed to build. And what the Chinese are saying is, you want us to complete these projects, but you're not allowing us to do so. That's the frustration. I was merely earlier alluding to the fact that the relations between these three countries are not necessarily settled, and that includes Beijing as well as Delhi. So I don't understand. Maybe there's some lack of ability to understand my English, but I thought I was very clear. I was talking about the general, and now I'm talking about particular. Two different
There is
points.
absolutely no lack of ability to understand English, Mr. Tenjan. The issue is that Hu Yanqi, and you are sort of papering over it. Hu Yanqi, the example I gave, she was seen to be openly meddling in government formation efforts in Kathmandu. And Chen Song, the present
that's your
ambassador to
impression.
Kathmandu from Beijing, he in September took potshots at India and said that India is not good for Nepal. So he was trying to create a wedge between India and Nepal. And then on that note, let me take this to Sushant. Sushant, you think China has got a little psyched out that in the present, India has fantastic equations in its neighborhood with Nepal, with Bhutan, with Sri Lanka. Forget the exception of Pakistan and Maldives. They have just sort of managed to almost steal an election based on certain promises which Chinese seldom keep.
So Abhishek, I think it's important to clarify that our English is not as poor as Mr. Tangent would like to imagine it to be, and we understand when somebody makes insinuations that it was on India's prompting that the Nepalese started obstructing some of these projects, as though Nepal does not have its own agency. And I think the Nepalese are extremely proud people with their own agency and can take their own decisions. They don't need India to nudge them. Yes, if there is a certain project that comes up, India as a traditional friend of Nepal, we will certainly ask, have you thought this through? Have you thought through the finances? Have you thought through of the time when you need to pay back? Because the Chinese are quite notorious for, putting their thumb on your neck to take out their money. We are seeing that with their iron brothers, the Pakistanis. The rest of the world is expected to make concessions to, Pakistan and give them some relief. But the Chinese don't reduce a single percentage point on the loans they have given, or delay those loans or restructure those loans. They might roll them over, but very often they roll them over at higher rates of interest. The Pakistanis are so deeply in hawk with the Chinese, they can't even say anything. So we would want to avoid a similar situation to happen to the rest of our friends, and because ultimately then what happens? When it comes to Sri Lanka, who is the first country which exerts to bail them out? It is India. It's not the Chinese. The Chinese, for the longest, stuck out and refused to do anything. It was only when they were shamed into doing something that they came around to agree to some debt restructuring. But on the larger question, Abhishek, which you raised, I
Right.
think the problem with the Chinese is that, despite all the progress they've made, and that's a remarkable amount of progress they've made, and no quibbling on that. In fact, it's admirable what they've managed to do. And yet,
Right.
the kind of pettiness which they
Sushant.
display, the kind of small-mindedness which they display, and the kind of insecurities which these guys display, it's funny.
Yeah.
For a country the size of China, with all
Yes.
the boasting which they do,
Sushant.
the highfalutin logic which they give, and
Sushant.
the perception which they have of themselves,
Sushant.
they are so petty and insecure that it's amazing. And
I
then
have
they
really run
fight.
out of time,
No,
Sushant.
one second, I need to make this point, Abhishek. He was accusing us of having a border dispute with Nepal. What about the fact that the Chinese are actually encroaching on Nepalese territory and then threatening the Nepalese that don't talk about it, otherwise we'll encroach even more? It's kind of strange. Chinese, very petty people, I must say. Very small-minded, very petty.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think, Sushant, taking lessons from what has happened to Sri Lanka, wiser after the debt trap that Pakistan is in, Nepal is not playing ball, and the Chinese are really not liking it. That's why increase in the number of those delegations. That's why this hectoring and lecturing. I'm sure the Nepali leadership would have the wisdom and the depth to come out of this and take care of their country. Of course, India is there to help. Thank you so much, Sushant, for joining us. And of course, Ina Tenjin from Beijing for the China perspective. We lost Anil Giri there, but then we had a nice conversation and short break, live and breaking on the other side. The debate is back tomorrow 9 p.m. Thank you so much, friends, for joining this evening.